A man works for 40 years, retires on Friday, and is dead before Christmas. Most people blame age, bad luck, or a body that finally stopped fighting. But retirement itself may not be the killer. The real danger begins when work disappears and takes your identity, routine, social world, and reason to wake up with it. Today, you will discover why some people quietly decline after retirement, and the 3 things that can help you avoid becoming the next story everyone remembers. Everyone seems to know a story like this. A man gives 40 years to his company, attends his retirement party on Friday, accepts the gold watch, and promises that he will finally enjoy his life. Then, before Christmas, he is gone. A heart attack, a stroke, cancer discovered too late, or a sudden decline that nobody can fully explain. The details change, but the conclusion remains the same. He stopped working, and soon afterward, his body stopped fighting. That story is so frightening because it feels believable. It suggests that work was the only thing keeping him alive, and the moment he handed in his badge, some invisible clock began counting down. But retirement itself is not a death sentence. There is no universal cliff where the human body suddenly gives up on the first morning without a job. Many people feel healthier after retiring because the pressure lifts, their sleep improves, and they finally have time to care for themselves. When a serious illness appears shortly after retirement, it may have been developing silently for years. The real danger is more complicated. Retirement may not create the damage. It may simply remove everything that was helping a person ignore it. Richard was 61 when he retired, after nearly 40 years in the same industry. At his farewell party, people shook his hand, praised his loyalty, and told him how lucky he was. His manager gave him a watch. His co-workers promised to stay in touch. Someone joked that Richard would be fishing every morning, while the rest of them sat in traffic. Richard smiled because that was what the moment required. Nobody asked him what he would become after he was no longer the man everyone called when something went wrong. For most of his adult life, Richard had been in survival mode. He worked 70-hour weeks when the company needed him. He answered calls during family dinners. He went to work with back pain, headaches, and nights of almost no sleep. He helped care for his aging mother, paid part of his daughter's rent, and quietly covered one emergency after another. He did not describe any of this as trauma. He called it responsibility. Men like Richard were trained to survive first and feel the consequences later. Pain could wait. Exhaustion could wait. Fear could wait. There was always another shift, another payment, another family problem, or another person depending on them. As long as Richard remained in motion, he never had to ask how much the motion was costing him. The first weeks of retirement felt like a vacation. He slept a little later, repaired things around the house, and enjoyed not having to answer his phone. He told himself that this was the freedom he had earned. Then Monday mornings began to feel different. Richard still woke before sunrise because his body had followed the same schedule for decades. He made coffee, walked into the garage, and stood beside his car. There was nowhere he needed to go. No meeting was waiting for him. No younger employee needed his judgment. No emergency required the skills he had spent a lifetime developing. The company continued without him. That should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like evidence that he had already been erased. Richard did not only lose a paycheck when he retired, he lost a structure that told him when to wake up, where to go, what problems mattered, and how to measure whether the day had been useful. He lost the title that had answered the question, "Who are you?" before he ever had to think about it. When a person has spent 40 years connecting worth to productivity, retirement can feel less like freedom and more like disappearance. Then there was the social loss. Richard had never called his co-workers his closest friends. They rarely visited one another's homes, and they did not talk openly about loneliness. But they had shared coffee, complaints, jokes, deadlines, and difficult mornings for decades. Those small interactions formed most of Richard's social world. After he retired, they vanished almost overnight. The promised phone calls became occasional messages. The occasional messages eventually stopped. His former co-workers were not cruel. They were busy surviving the same system Richard had just left. Richard had believed that his family would fill the empty space. He imagined more dinners with his children and more time with the people for whom he had sacrificed so much. But his children had careers, bills, relationships, and problems of their own. They did not need more time with Richard in the way he had imagined. They still called, but often because something needed to be repaired, paid for, or rescued. When his son asked him to withdraw money from his retirement account to solve another financial crisis, Richard finally said no. The silence that followed wounded him more deeply than he expected. He began wondering whether people had loved him or had simply loved his usefulness. At work, his value had disappeared when his labor stopped. Now he feared that the same thing might happen inside his family when his financial sacrifices stopped. That is the kind of pain many retired men never describe. They do not say that they feel abandoned. They say they are tired. They do not say that they have lost their identity. They say they are enjoying the quiet. They do not say that every empty morning frightens them. They say they are taking it easy. But the body still records what the mouth refuses to admit. Richard began sleeping later and moving less. Breakfast happened at noon. A drink that once belonged to Saturday evening began appearing on ordinary afternoons. He stopped checking the calendar because there was rarely anything on it. The less he moved, the more exhausted he felt. The more exhausted he felt, the less reason he found to leave the house. Small warning signs were easy to ignore. He had ignored discomfort for most of his life. Why would retirement suddenly change that? Meanwhile, the salary had stopped, but the anxiety had not. Richard checked his savings repeatedly. Every medical expense felt threatening. Every market decline looked like a warning that he might outlive the money he had spent 40 years accumulating. He was no longer working, but his nervous system had not learned how to rest. This is the hidden danger behind so many stories of people declining after retirement. It is not always the act of leaving a job. It is the sudden removal of identity, routine, movement, community, and purpose from a life that was built almost entirely around work. Work may have been exhausting Richard, but it was also organizing him. It gave him somewhere to go, people who noticed his absence, and proof that he was still necessary. Once those things disappeared, the damage he had postponed was left alone with him. One Monday morning, Richard woke at 5, dressed automatically, and poured coffee into the travel mug he had carried for years. Only after picking up his keys did he remember that nobody was waiting for him. He sat alone in the garage as the sun came up. Richard was not afraid of dying at that moment. He was afraid that the meaningful part of his life had already ended. And that is the question hiding beneath the retirement stories nobody can forget. If stopping work does not start a death clock, what allows one person to flourish after retirement while another quietly begins to disappear? The answer begins with understanding that retirement is not an ending. It is a transition between two identities. The people who flourish are not necessarily the ones with the largest savings accounts, the healthiest bodies, or the most exciting hobbies. They are often the ones who understand that they must retire towards something, not merely away from something. Richard had spent years planning how to leave his job. He had calculated his pension, paid down his mortgage, and watched his retirement account. He knew approximately how much money he could spend each month. What he had never calculated was how much identity he would lose on his final day. Nobody had warned him that financial preparation and psychological preparation were not the same thing. For several weeks, Richard continued drifting. He waited to feel motivated, but motivation rarely arrives in an empty room. Without a reason to leave the house, each day became slightly smaller than the one before it. Then one morning, an old coworker named Frank called him. Frank did not ask Richard to return to work. He asked if Richard would speak to a group of young apprentices who were struggling with the practical side of the trade. Richard almost refused. He told himself that the industry belonged to younger people now. But something inside him responded to the possibility that his experience might still have somewhere to go. He agreed to give them one afternoon. That afternoon did not magically solve his life. It did something more important. It reminded him that the end of employment did not have to mean the end of contribution. The young apprentices did not need Richard to carry their responsibilities. They needed him to translate 40 years of mistakes, judgment, and hard-earned knowledge into something they could use. For the first time since retiring, Richard came home tired in a satisfying way. That distinction matters. Purpose after retirement does not mean replacing an exhausting career with another exhausting career. It does not mean remaining productive every minute, or proving that you still deserve to exist. Purpose is simply a reason to participate in life. It is the feeling that your presence still connects to something beyond your own thoughts. Richard began with one afternoon each week. Then he added a second morning to help coordinate a community repair project. He was not trying to become important again. He was creating places where his absence would be noticed. That is one of the most protective things a retired person can build, a calendar containing people who expect to see them. Work once provided this automatically. It decided when Richard woke, where he went, whom he saw, and what needed his attention. After retirement, he had to build that structure deliberately. He stopped waiting for the day to give him direction. On Sunday evening, he planned the week ahead. Tuesday was for the apprenticeship program. Thursday morning was for the community project. Friday was breakfast with Frank. 3 mornings each week began with a walk at the same time. These commitments appeared ordinary, but ordinary structure is often what prevents freedom from becoming isolation. Richard also learned that one person could not become his entire social world. His wife loved him, but she could not replace 40 years of co-workers, conversations, and shared responsibilities. Retirement was his transition, but it was affecting both of them. Suddenly, he was home every day, quietly expecting her schedule to expand around his emptiness. When he recognized this, he stopped waiting for her to entertain him. He began rebuilding connections of his own. This was uncomfortable. Many men of Richard's generation had learned how to work beside other men without learning how to ask them for friendship. They could discuss engines, deadlines, sports, or politics, but saying, "I have been isolated, and I would like to see you," felt almost impossible. Richard started with a simpler sentence. "Do you want to get breakfast on Friday?" That was enough. The next part of his recovery involved his body. Richard had spent decades treating it like equipment owned by the company. If it still functioned, he continued using it. Pain was managed, exhaustion was ignored, and medical appointments were postponed until something became impossible to deny. Retirement offered him a chance to stop doing that. He scheduled the examinations he had delayed. He spoke honestly about his sleep, his drinking, and the pressure he had been carrying. He began walking before he felt ready. He reduced the afternoons spent sitting alone with a glass in his hand. None of this made Richard weak. It required a different kind of discipline. The old discipline said, "Ignore what you feel and finish the job." The new discipline said, "Pay attention before the damage becomes permanent." For Richard, this was a profound change. He had always believed that survival meant tolerating more. Now he was learning that survival could also mean refusing to abandon himself. Then came the more painful work of establishing boundaries with his family. Richard's son remained distant after Richard refused to withdraw money from his retirement account. Richard felt the familiar urge to repair the relationship by surrendering. He considered transferring the money, even though doing so would weaken the security he and his wife had spent decades building. For most of his life, Richard had confused love with rescue. If someone he loved was struggling, he believed it was his responsibility to absorb the consequences. But retirement made that pattern impossible to ignore. He could no longer sacrifice indefinitely and assume that more money, more labor, or more self-denial would eventually purchase closeness. Richard called his son and said, "I love you, and I will help you think through the problem, but I will not risk our retirement to remove the consequences of your decision." His son did not respond warmly. The boundary did not produce instant reconciliation. Healthy boundaries often reveal the truth before they create peace. Richard had to endure the silence without using money to make it disappear. He reminded himself that saying no did not make him a bad father. Protecting his health, home, marriage, and financial stability was not selfish. He was allowed to stop being the emergency system for every adult around him. This was one of the hardest lessons of Richard's retirement. He still had value when he was not rescuing anyone. He still had value when no one needed money from him. He still had value on days when he produced nothing measurable. That realization began separating his identity from his usefulness. Financial stability remained important, but Richard stopped treating fear as a financial plan. He and his wife reviewed what they actually needed, what reliable income they had, and which expenses required adjustment. They built a clear income floor for essential costs and kept emergency reserves for the unexpected. Clarity did not remove every risk. It removed the exhausting habit of recalculating their entire future every time the market moved. A retirement plan should not only answer, "Can I afford to stop working?" It should also answer, "What kind of life will this money support?" A person can have enough money and still be emotionally bankrupt. Another person can live modestly but remain connected, active, and deeply engaged with life. Financial security matters because it creates choices. It cannot choose a purpose on your behalf. For those approaching retirement, a gradual transition may help. That could mean reducing working hours, accepting seasonal work, consulting occasionally, or mentoring someone who will carry the knowledge forward. Not everyone has that option. Some people are laid off, forced out by illness, or pushed into retirement before they are ready. But even when the final day cannot be controlled, the life built afterward still can be shaped. And if you have already retired and feel yourself disappearing, it is not too late. You do not need a dramatic reinvention. You need one honest reason to leave the house, one place where people know your name, and one commitment that asks you to return next week. Start small enough that you cannot hide behind perfection. Call one former coworker. Attend one community meeting. Help one person learn something you spent decades mastering. Walk for 20 minutes tomorrow morning and do it again at the same time 2 days later. Schedule the examination you have been avoiding. Remove the alcohol from the hour when loneliness is strongest. Tell the truth to someone you trust before your silence becomes your entire world. Most importantly, allow yourself to grieve. Even a chosen retirement contains loss. You may grieve the title, routine, authority, friendships, or version of yourself that existed inside the workplace. Gratitude for freedom does not cancel grief for what ended. Richard stopped shaming himself for missing parts of the life that had exhausted him. He could be relieved that the pressure was over and still mourn the man he had been. Both feelings could exist at the same time. 6 months later, Richard still woke early, but the silence no longer felt like proof that his life was finished. On Tuesdays, a group of apprentices waited for him. On Thursdays, neighbors knew he would arrive with his tools. On Fridays, Frank saved him a seat at breakfast. His relationship with his son remained imperfect, but Richard no longer purchased temporary peace by betraying his own limits. He left the door open without leaving his retirement account open. He moved more. He drank less. He attended his medical appointments. Some mornings were still lonely, but loneliness was no longer the only structure in his life. Richard had not returned to the man he was before retirement. He had become someone who could contribute without being consumed, love without constantly rescuing, and rest without believing that rest made him worthless. That is the difference between retiring from life and retiring from a job. The frightening stories about people dying shortly after retirement will continue to spread because they contain dread, injustice, and a painful question. How can someone sacrifice 40 years for a future and then lose that future almost immediately? But the lesson should not be that you must keep working until your body collapses. The lesson is that a paycheck cannot be the only thing connecting you to life. Before retirement, ask yourself 3 questions. What will make me get up in the morning? Who will I see during an ordinary week? How will I continue moving my body? If those questions have no answers, do not panic. Begin building the answers now. Your job may end on a specific date, but your purpose does not have to leave with it. Your badge can be returned. Your title can be given to someone younger. Your office can be emptied before the end of the afternoon. But your experience, judgment, character, and capacity to begin again still belong to you. Retirement does not start a death clock. It reveals whether you have built a life beyond work. If you have already retired, tell us what gives you a reason to get up in the morning. If you are approaching retirement, share the part of the transition that concerns you most. Your story may reach someone sitting alone in their garage, wondering whether anyone else understands. And in the next video, we will explore how to rebuild your identity after retirement when the world no longer needs the role you spent your entire life performing.